Let's wait 1 more minute before we start.
I'm very impressed with how international this group is.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I guess it's about time. So welcome everyone to the Open Applied Linguistics Reading Club series, a Meet the Author series. We are very excited and happy and honored to welcome Professor Dorothy Bishop from the University of Oxford to talk about fallibility in science, responding to errors in the work of oneself and others. Professor Dorothy Bishop is an emeritus professor of developmental neuropsychology at the University of Oxford. She is a fellow of Academy of Medical Sciences, a fellow of British Academy, and a fellow of the Royal Society. Professor Bishop researches language impairments in children, but beyond psychology, she is active in the field of open science and research reproducibility. She was the first chair of the UK Reproducibility Network and a founder member of Reproducible Research Oxford. So today's agenda will be, first there will be an interview with Professor Bishop, and then there will be a free Q&A. So do prepare your questions about the reading, which is as the same title of our discussion today, Fallibility in Science, Responding to Errors in the Work of Oneself and Others, published on Advances in Methods and Practices in Psychology Science in 2018. So welcome, Professor Bishop. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Why don't we?
Yeah, very good to be here.
Yeah, why don't we start with a general question about the topic? Could you briefly introduce the topic to our audience and also this paper?
Yes. So it's a topic that I think is very seldom talked about in the sort of area I work in of psychology and behavioral science more broadly, which is what to do about mistakes. And essentially, it covers the two aspects where errors can occur. One is, what should you do if you find you have made a mistake in something that you have written or published, or an experiment that you've done? How should one approach that? And then the second aspect is, what about if you find mistakes in the work of other people? What's the appropriate way to respond to that? So that's the sort of broad divide. And I guess the second part about the mistakes made by other people also draws some sort of distinction between what about mistakes which are just honest errors, or something that went wrong without any evil intent. And then there's the much more difficult category where you have people who have committed some sort of misconduct and where you think you may have found a case of fraud or plagiarism or such like. So I try to just sort of look at what we know about how people do handle these things. It's a very it's not a scientific paper in the normal sense. It's described as a commentary, and it's really a collection of thoughts that I've had thinking about these issues myself and reading around what other people have had to say. But it's a fairly informal paper.
Yeah, thank you for the general introduction. I guess before we sort of delve into the specific issues that you just briefly mentioned, I wanted to ask, like, what inspired you to write this paper or this commentary? And could you share with us sort of any behind the scenes stories for this commentary?
Funnily enough, when I saw this question, my memory for the past is terrible, and this was 5 years ago. So I thought, have I got this right? And then I was amused to see that what I remembered was also agreed with what is said at the end of the paper, which is that the initial impetus came because I was invited to give a talk on this topic at a meeting in Cardiff by a guy called David Mailer. Now, David had been a student on a course that I was running with Marcus Munafo and Chris Chambers, which was a week-long course on methods in open and reproducible science. And so he knew me quite well, and he wanted to run a session in his own university on broadly similar topics. But he specifically suggested this topic, I think on the basis that we'd had some discussions. So this week-long course was nice because, as well as some formal sessions, we had a lot of time for informal chat, and we must have had some discussions about this topic. And I think he felt that there was a need to cover it. So I prepared some thoughts and gave a presentation there. And then what I can't remember is how that then turned into an actual published paper. But I do remember that the journal that it's published in was just starting up, and that's Advances in Methods in Psychological Methods and Practices or something. Yeah, I can't remember. Yeah, a long and complicated title, but it was a new journal. And I think I was asked if I would contribute something to it. And this seemed like a very good topic because, as I say, actually rather little has been written about it, particularly in the official literature. A lot of what I ended up referring to was in blogs or in less formal context.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story. And you're right that this topic may not be that new to everyone in our field, and many people will think that responding to errors is something that quite scary, and they don't know how to react to it. And there's a general perception mentioned in your article that admission of errors will harm the reputation of the author. And how should we understand the relationship between admitting errors and the author's reputation?
Yes, I think this is perhaps one of the big points I wanted to get across, which is that actually admitting errors often it will either have no effect on your reputation, but it can increase your reputation and enhance it if people then come away with the idea that you are somebody who is prepared to be honest, even if it is in a context where it might not make you look good. And I remember quite early on when I was I've been on Twitter now for over 10 years. And when I first joined Twitter, I was very impressed by a science journalist called Ed Yong, because he told this story on Twitter about how he had written a science article about some medical condition. I can't remember what it was, but he then got some fairly hostile criticism from a support group for people with this condition, saying he got something about the condition seriously wrong. And what impressed me was that he could have just sort of either done a correction but not told anybody, but he actually went to some length to say he was, he'd made this mistake and he was sorry and he was correcting it. I remember just thinking, this is how people should behave. And you didn't think any of the worse from him at all. You thought, actually, this gives me confidence in this guy that, you know, if he makes a mistake, he's at pains to correct it. So I try to, you know, do something similar myself. But it is hard because it's not a natural human tendency. The natural human tendency is to hope that if you keep very quiet, it will all go away. And you know, it's not easy to sort of come out and say, actually, I did make this mistake. But I think the lessons, and there are some real life case examples in this paper, is that actually the people who are the first to criticize their own work and point out that there have been problems often come away with a better reputation rather than a worse one.
Yeah, thank you for sort of sharing that. I think that might change people's sort of perception about how vulnerable it is for being open and transparent. I guess it is indeed sort of counterintuitive, and that's why we're really hoping that by talking with you and by promoting this commentary, that more and more people can start thinking about this differently, so that they can respond to the situation, you know, with a sort of more healthy and constructive attitude, I guess.
Yes.
Right. So the next question is also related to the content of your commentary. Like, what is the role of open science in reducing errors in research?
Yeah. In some ways, open science will increase errors because it will make it easier to find them. So, you know, if your data is open, and your analysis scripts are open, anybody can come along and try and run the analysis and check it out and find an error. And people do find errors in people's analysis code. But the thing is, if you talk to computer scientists, they say, well, of course there's errors in there. Everybody makes mistakes. And that's why it's important to have it open. It's because if you don't, these things may go on and nobody will find the errors. The fastest way to get errors detected is often to throw something open or get somebody else to check it, and they will pick things up. So I think the thing about open science is it makes it easy to detect and then correct the errors, so that overall there will be fewer errors in the research. But it makes people, again, feel very vulnerable. The other thing it does, though, is it also makes you much more careful, because I now try and have all my code and data for my projects open. And of course, you feel very, very scared putting it up there, because you know that the minute you've put it up there, you're going to see a mistake in it, or somebody will see a mistake in it. But of course, it then does make you more cautious. And I try now with, you know, if I'm doing an analysis, I mean, I'm now retired, I don't have a research group, but when I did have a research group, I would sort of say, let's have two people separately run, you know, actually write a script to do this analysis and check that we both get the same result, because it's surprisingly often that you don't. So things like that, I think open practices really do encourage, and you will end up with a better sort of science. But it's the idea that errors are entirely normal is much more accepted in some disciplines than others. And it's certainly accepted in, as I say, computing, where there's always this idea that many people have to check what you've done. Otherwise, the odds are very high that there will be a mistake that doesn't get picked up and has important consequences.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Having errors or detecting errors are completely normal, because we are people, we make mistakes. So don't be afraid of responding to errors. But there is a difference between responding to errors to the works of oneself and others. And what are the differences exactly?
Yeah, well, I think ideally one's attitude should be to sort of approach errors in the work of others in a way as that you would want people to approach errors in your work. So to, again, there's a nice example from a blog post, I think, in the paper, of somebody who says, well, when I was very young and brash and I found an error, I was all sort of, oh, this terrible person has made this error, you know, and sort of jumping up and down. And she said, now I wouldn't do that, because I realized, you know, and in fact, if you've had that happen to you, that somebody's, adopted that attitude, you realize just how unpleasant it is. And so the idea is to, again, on the grounds that any error that somebody else has made is probably something that you yourself could have made, you approach it in that fashion, with some degree of empathy and respect, and, giving people an opportunity to put things right. The difficulty arises if you are dealing with people who are not responsive to being told about this. And to my mind, it immediately makes me rather suspicious if people either don't reply or get very defensive. And you then start to think, well, is it really just an honest mistake, or are they worried, have they done something more intentional? But I think quite often people are defensive just because of this sense that it's a terrible shaming thing, and they're not happy about it. So I think the main thing is to try and emphasize again that, it's not a judgment of the person because it's a normal thing. The article, in fact, that I have recommended by Julia Strand, which is still, I think it's in press, but it's in the preprint stage. I was very fortunate to be asked to review that. And she goes way beyond anything I've said in this article, and has a whole set of ideas and exercises, arguing that what leads to errors is not so much individuals, but it's the culture that you're working in, the research culture and the systems. And she draws parallels with research on safety in areas like nuclear reactors and hospital medicine, where what people have learned is that if you want to stop errors, you don't sort of point the finger and try and find out who is guilty of the error, but you try and fix the system so that the error is less likely to occur. And she's got some really nice, very practical suggestions for how we can do that more in sort of a scientific lab-based context. So that's a long answer, but it's really the way we respond is we can recognize what situations cause errors and try to prevent them that way. I hope that's helpful, and I certainly would recommend that article.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a very insightful point. Like we have to approach the errors, not just by turning it into a personal attack kind of thing. We have to think sort of more systematically, like what are the more sustainable ways to address the errors and things like that.
Yes.
And so I think your commentary also mentioned some common errors in the interpretation of data. So it might be helpful to sort of raise the awareness among our audience, like what are those common errors? And also you used a really interesting term called paltering. Maybe you can explain a little bit about what that term means. Yeah.
Yes. So what I think a lot of people have been trained to do research without really good grounding in the basics of the sort of statistical methods that are often used. And some of you may not be using more quantitative methods, but certainly if you do use quantitative methods, unfortunately, it's not uncommon for people to just be told, well, run a t-test or run an analysis and get excited if p-values are less than 0.05. It really is a lot more complicated than that. And a common error is to just run an awful lot of analyses and then just focus on the ones that give you this significant result without appreciating that the meaning of a p-value is very dependent on the context in which it occurs. And if you run a lot of analyses, it's not particularly surprising to get a low p-value, and it may not be meaningful. And the way I try and explain that usually is by saying, if I had a friend and my friend is a magician and he comes, you come to see us and he says, oh, well, I can deal you a particular type of card hand in poker, something like a full house, a relatively rare type of hand, and you sit down and he does that without any cheating, you would be very impressed. But if you knew that he'd actually gone round to 50 people's houses and tried this with all of them, but only succeeded with one, you would then think, he's not particularly good, because that's no better than chance. So the fact that that's a very rare hand isn't what makes it impressive. It's really that you have to combine that with how many tests were done and in what context. And this is what people miss a lot of the time. They just keep testing or keep subdividing the data or trying different things until they can get this sense of there's a significant result. And that has led to a lot of difficulties with non-replicable effect, because it does just lead to a lot of false positives. And that's what's known as p-hacking. And paltering is a more general term that is used actually in things like business studies, where people are looking at what sort of methods salesmen use in order to sell something to you. And paltering is like when somebody's trying to sell you a car and you sort of say, well, is it reliable? And they come back and say something like, well, this car has gone 5,000 miles and it's never needed a change of oil, or something like that, which it doesn't quite answer your question, but sounds good. It's the sort of thing politicians do all the time. They don't quite answer the question, but they say something related that gives you an impression all is well. And I think I in this paper, I think I said that paltering, you could say this sort of p-hacking is a bit like paltering, because people will report just the results that were significant and not mention all the others, and think that's fine because they're not actually saying something untrue, because that's what the statistics came out as. But the point is, if you do only partially report your data, that is actually very misleading, and can lead people to have much more confidence in your data than they should. So this sort of tendency to leave out things that don't work in the way you'd like is a big issue in a lot of science. I think it's one of the commonest reasons why people do end up with results that, just then fail to replicate.
Yeah, I think some researchers are too worried or too nervous about their findings and whether they're consistent with previous findings or inconsistent with previous findings. So it's really important that, especially when we do replication studies, to interpret the findings as whether it is an indicator of fallibility. And could you tell us why failure to replicate is not a reliable indicator of fallibility?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole load of reasons why things may not replicate, and it comes down to the fact that most of us are working in areas where we're dealing with probabilistic phenomena. So it's not like some branches of physics where you really have a clear formula that can predict how A leads to B and so on. So we are dealing with probabilistic phenomena, and that is why we have to use things like p-values, which can give us some sort of indication of which results are not, are suggestive that we aren't just dealing with random chance events. So if you do try and repeat somebody's study, it's entirely possible that one person gets a so-called significant difference and the next person does the same thing and doesn't, because of just the play of chance, particularly if that initial result might well have been just a false positive, or it may be that the person coming afterwards who tries to replicate it didn't get the result because it's a rather small effect and it needs a bigger sample to show the results properly. There's also the whole business of the extent to which our results may depend very much on particular conditions in which an experiment was done, or even the skill of the experimenter. The problem is, once you start straying into those territories, it's often used as an excuse, in the sense that people will say, well, you didn't get this result because you were incompetent in running the study. And that is, again, to me, that's a bit of a red flag if somebody comes back with that as an argument. So my view is that if somebody does a study and it doesn't replicate, then it's really raising a question as to why. And there's a number of reasons. I mean, at one extreme, it could be that the initial finding was entirely fraudulent, but that's not the most likely explanation. A more likely explanation is just that there are so many factors that conspire to mean that you either do or don't show the effect, that it may be that one of the studies is finding it and the other not, because it's the play of chance, or there may be specific conditions. So you need to get to the bottom of why that is the case. And in a lot of replication studies these days, where people are trying to see what does and doesn't replicate, the replication will be deliberately designed with the person who did the original study to ensure that the methods are in agreement, and will be carefully designed to be large enough and powerful enough to really show an effect if it's really there. So I think the art of replicating studies is developing as people realize it's not enough to just say, oh, well, you got the result, I didn't get the result.
Yes, these are very good points. Like, I see a great resonance between what you've just said and one of our earlier sessions. We had a session on replication studies as well. So it's just, there is a lot more complexity and nuance to the phenomena of failure to replicate. So we really need to sort of turn it into a collaborative endeavor, as opposed to a sort of oppositional, or, you know, things like that, when you just interpret this as a binary sort of outcome, like either you replicate or you don't, or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Now we've covered some of the, I guess, the more innocuous sort of kind of errors and mistakes, and we will be moving into a sort of slightly more challenging or difficult topic, that is deliberate omission, misrepresentation, and misconduct. So what are the challenges in dealing with this type of behavior, and what, in your opinion, would be the right way and wrong ways to approach this?
Yes, well, my goodness, this is really hard. And I mean, for a start, it's hard. It can be hard sometimes to know whether something is intentional or unintentional, in terms of, you know, if somebody's done something that looks highly suspicious, but occasionally you do have situations where the evidence is so strong that, you know, somebody, I mean, in the field of biological sciences, quite often you can find instances where somebody is using some image of, you know, some cells or something, and then you find they've used the same image in a completely different paper to represent something completely different. Now, if that happens once, you could say, well, that could be an honest error. You picked up the wrong file and put it in the paper. And I have to say, I've recently published a paper where I had to write back to the journal after it was published saying, I'm sorry, that figure, I had it the wrong way around or something. I mean, this happens. But if it keeps happening, then, or if somebody's actually very obviously cut and pasted in a figure, there was a recent case where somebody had a graph, and then the same graph was in a different paper, but they pasted over the x-axis to give the scale, make a different scale. And you sort of think, you know, that's not something you do by accident. There've been examples of people who've had open data, and then in the open data, it's been evident that they've just cut and pasted blocks of numbers. Or even in one case, somebody left behind a formula that converted variable A into variable B, and they were supposed to be separate measurements. So, I mean, things like that, and you start thinking, yeah, that is definitely somebody doing something fraudulent. And the difficulty is that there's not, on the one hand, you need to be incredibly sure on certain of your ground, because this is very high stakes. In theory, if somebody's found guilty of fraud, they could be fired. In theory, you know, their reputation could be ruined. So you don't make such accusations lightly. But if there is unambiguous evidence, then the problem is finding anybody who will take it seriously. So I am part of a Slack group of people who self-describe as scientific sleuths, because in my retirement, I have got interested in fraud. And the thing that people say initially is that they think all the difficult work is doing all the groundwork to really show that this really is fraud, and sometimes going back to the author and looking at data and reanalyzing and so on, and showing that there's patterns in the data that are just impossible and couldn't have risen just by chance. And you think that that's all the hard work that you're doing, but actually the hard work is then getting anybody to take any notice of this. So you have various options, and you can write to the journal editor, you can write to the publisher, you can write to the person's institution. But it's relatively unusual for this to get any sort of action at all, and certainly rapid action is unusual. In part, this is because these organizations tend to be naturally cautious, and again, they don't want to accuse somebody falsely, and they, of course, may think that you could be somebody who is making a false accusation, so they need to be careful. But a lot of it is also that they're just very scared of being sued. So it can be very, very expensive if a journal decides to retract somebody's paper and that person doesn't agree with the retraction, they may decide to get a lawyer to start challenging the retraction. And similarly, I have had conversations with high up people in academic institutions about why they haven't acted when somebody's clearly deliberately behaved in a fraudulent fashion. And it typically ultimately comes down to taking the view that it would cost them so much money if the other side got lawyers that it's just not worth it, even though they agree that this is fraud. Now, this is really depressing. And some of the cases are serious ones with medical implications where people may actually die as a consequence of a fraudulent paper getting taken seriously. So this is something I think currently our scientific systems are not very well geared up to cope with. And I can only say that, some people are trying to fight back against this, but it is enormously difficult. I don't think it's helped by the fact that some of the people who are sleuths and are very, very good at sleuthing are also very aggressive about how they go around commenting. And they will use mockery and they will use insults, which I can understand how they get to that point, because if nothing else works, you start to get to the point where you want to perhaps ventilate a bit. But it can be really problematic, because once the people in the establishment just assume you're some sort of, person who goes around swearing and insulting people and so on, you basically find it much, much harder to get taken seriously. So when I do try and, when I've been in cases where I've raised issues, I try to be very proper, scrupulously polite, and just list the evidence for problems without making personal judgments on the people. So you just really need to make the case that here is a set of figures that don't make sense, or here is a graph that's been reused across several papers to mean different things, and how is that to be explained, sort of thing. But it's hard, and the whistleblowers themselves will often end up suffering more than the fraudsters. It's rather, I think it's quite analogous to cases of where people complain of sexual abuse, for example, where a lot of wrongdoing is not acted on because of conflicts of interests in institutions and so on, and concerns about legal repercussions. And then what happens is that the whistleblower may be sort of, lose their job or have to leave, or end up with themselves being targeted. So it's part of, I think, modern life, really, where more and more fraudulent and dishonest people one has to fight quite hard against them, and it's a difficult fight.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of this and your own experience. And I have to say that all the cases and occasions we have discussed are really difficult to deal with, and responding to errors really needs to be done case by case. You have to deal with lots of different people, different parties, and different people from their standpoint. They will have different preference that best will meet their interests. So it's really hard for
and it's hard
to do this.
I know I often sort of feel very bad, you know, because I think, well, you know, if somebody's accused of fraud and there's good evidence, you still, I mean, I still feel some empathy and I feel sorry for them. But I think the problem is that this sort of fraud is not victimless. And the worst cases are where it is a medically relevant and or maybe related to sort of issues, you know, safety issues, for example. But I think also the victims are the sort of general public who want to use research and, you know, money may be wasted. For example, you know, using a drug that doesn't actually work or an educational intervention that doesn't work. And in addition, what is worrying is, why do people do this? Well, they do it in order to progress in their career. And that is a disadvantage for the honest people who don't want to do that. And I do know of cases where in a lab where one of the more senior people is engaging in misconduct, the junior people who are any good will leave the field, will leave science altogether, because you know, that they are disgusted by what they see, and it's quite clear that they are not going to be able to overcome this. And that is very serious for all of us if the good people start to leave. So I think that's what motivates me to take action. It's that I think that when you start to really look at the consequences of allowing fraud to flourish, they're not trivial.
Yeah. And I was wondering, given the difficulty and seriousness of all these problems, what are some general principles that we can remember when we respond to fallibility?
I think probably the general principles are coming back to the idea that on the one hand, realize that certainly in terms of honest errors, that is very, very common and that we will all make them. The second general principle is to try to organize your work to prevent them. But even if you do that, they will occur, but there are ways to minimize the likelihood. And it tends to mean that you need to do things at the level of the group of people, that the lab, that you have general structures and principles in place for doing things like checking, and for also adopting a very positive attitude towards reporting when errors do occur, and sort of taking the view, what can we learn from this, rather than blaming the person who did the error. One of the examples in the fallibility paper is neuroscientist Russ Poldrack, who's very senior, and on his blog, he just reported this case where he had made an error in some analysis code that led to a completely false conclusion. One of his graduate students picked it up and came to him with it. And he now, in his lab, runs regular sessions of sort of, you know, where people would, on the one hand, check each other's code, but also discuss errors and discuss, how did that error happen? Could we have prevented it? And so adopting this much more positive, proactive approach to looking for errors and assuming they'll be there rather than pretending that they won't be. And then, you know, finally, I think the other response is just, you know, bearing in mind that we are all human and trying not to turn it into a really antagonistic battle against people if you do find errors in their work, but rather to be more empathic about it.
Yeah, thank you for giving us these many very useful principles. Again, I feel like exactly like you said in the beginning, this is a topic that people don't often talk about, but they actually have, you know, their own thoughts or private thoughts or feelings or fears about. Yeah. And yeah, so that is really, it's like the elephant in the room that I'm really glad that we're talking about this more explicitly so that people can start thinking about this. And I wonder if now that you've raised many great points, what would be the, you know, if there is any, like one most important lesson that the readers or the audience can take from your commentary? Yeah.
Well, I think it is this business of trying to instill a culture that it anticipates fraud and is designed to cope with it. And again, I would recommend strongly the Julia Strand article for that, because what is nice about her article is how practical it is, and how she has many examples of, you know, the sorts of things that can go wrong, And she, in fact, suggests there should be some, that students should discuss this in a lab group and think about, what could go wrong before it happens. So I think this anticipating error and setting up your working practices, which will include the use of open practices to try and minimize error, is a really good strategy. And it's something I certainly was never trained to do that myself. I think all our training tends to be telling us how to do things right, but it doesn't really, protect you against the errors that can occur. I guess there's one other message I'd take. It's that errors are genuine. I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but I think errors really are learning experiences. So I find that, I've learned more from making mistakes and then realizing why I've made them and recovering from them probably than any other route, because they stick in your mind that, you got that wrong and then you had to work out what was wrong about it. That's particularly true in things like, learning to code and more just sort of generally in learning things that you learn from your mistakes. And when I have Q&A with students, with lectures and things, and you sort of ask somebody a question and that you can see they're all scared that they might give you an answer that's wrong. And I'm always saying, it doesn't matter if it's wrong. If it's wrong, we'll discuss it and you'll learn from that. And but people don't like to be seen to be wrong. And I think that once you can overcome that, that's a good thing. And I feel one reason I try to talk about this as well is that I feel it's important that senior people stand up and say, yeah, I make mistakes. Yes, things can go wrong, because you need that sort of role model rather than the boss being seen as some sort of infallible person, because they're not. We never are.
Yes, that's very much true. I think that's the most important lesson. Like, we're all humans, we're all fallible. So yeah, so I think that wraps up the sort of the interview part quite nicely. And now I would sort of propose that we stop the recording and we get into the free Q&A part.